the winter of 1875, 7 years after Timothy Caldwell vanished from the Missouri State Hospital, a chilling pattern of deaths began to spread across 3 Kansas counties. The victims, all elderly or gravely ill, had something in common. They had recently hired a polite, intelligent teenage caregiver named Thomas Whitfield. These weren't just ordinary deaths. They were carried out with a disturbing level of clinical precision, and Whitfield always disappeared just before anyone began to suspect foul play. Dr. Samuel Harding, now 68 and long retired, would spend his final years hunting the boy who had once tortured animals in the caves of Sedalia County. A boy who had grown into something far more dangerous, a predator who weaponized empathy. Before we explore the full horror of Timothy Caldwell's transformation, be sure to watch part 1 of this story if you haven't already. Subscribe to the channel and drop a comment if you remember where we left off with the boy who vanished from the asylum. By 1875, Thomas Whitfield had gained a strong reputation among Kansas's farming communities, not for heroism, but for his eerie consistency. Kansas was still reeling from the aftermath of the Civil War, with families pouring westward, many burdened with aging parents or wounded veterans. Medical care was scarce and costly in rural areas, so families turned to traveling caregivers. Young men and women would go from home to home, offering basic medical aid and comfort. Thomas seemed like a godsend. He was 19, well-mannered, articulate, and far too knowledgeable in medicine for someone without formal education. He claimed he had trained under a country doctor in Missouri, learning through observation. His references were glowing letters from families praising his gentleness, skill, and uncanny ability to soothe the dying. What made Thomas especially sought after was his willingness to accept the most difficult patients, those with dementia, terminal illnesses, or war-induced trauma. He never undercharged, but he wasn't expensive either. He would stay with a family anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks, always knowing exactly when his presence was no longer needed. Families valued his calm honesty and the way he guided them through their loved ones' final moments. Dr. Benjamin Wheeler, the county physician of Leavenworth, met Thomas in March of that year. The young man had come to file the death certificate for Martha Henley, an elderly woman with terminal consumption. Her death was expected, but something about Whitfield unsettled Wheeler. Unlike most caregivers, Thomas showed no hint of grief or emotional fatigue. He described Martha's decline with cold precision, using medical terms with the confidence of a trained doctor. Wheeler noted in his journal that Whitfield asked oddly specific questions: how causes of death were documented, what proof was required, how thoroughly officials investigated deaths among the elderly. Wheeler sensed the questions were not idle curiosity. They were calculated part of something far more sinister. Yet despite the unease, there was nothing in Thomas's conduct to raise suspicion, at least not then. The Morrison family spoke with genuine warmth about Thomas Whitfield. They described how he had stayed by their mother's side through countless difficult nights, administering medication with precision and offering steady comfort in her final hours. Her death, while deeply saddening, appeared natural. Just another chapter in the slow, familiar decline of illness. Thomas, meanwhile, moved on with quiet efficiency. His next patient was Samuel Morrison, a 73-year-old farmer recovering from a debilitating stroke. Morrison's son Robert had heard about Thomas through the Henley family, who had nothing but praise for the young caregiver who had made their mother's final weeks bearable. For exactly 4 weeks, Thomas tended to Samuel with steady discipline. Locals often spotted him walking the property before sunrise, sometimes carrying what looked like medical supplies, other times simply standing in the fields, silent and still. When asked about these habits, he explained that the morning air helped him stay strong while working with demanding patients. On a Tuesday morning in April, Morrison was found dead in his bed, another apparent stroke during the night. Thomas had discovered the body while preparing the morning dose of medication and immediately contacted Dr. Wheeler. Once again, the family praised his calmness and care, saying he had warned them just the day before that their father was deteriorating quickly. Robert Morrison told Wheeler that Thomas had mentioned signs of a second stroke and encouraged the family to prepare for the worst. When it happened, Robert said Thomas handled everything. He kept Dad comfortable. He made sure he wasn't alone. Dr. Wheeler's examination confirmed stroke-related complications. No signs of foul play. And yet Thomas remained curiously untouched by the death, once again asking about death certificates and how local officials conducted investigations. As spring turned to summer in 1875, a chilling pattern began to surface. Each of Thomas's patients died while under his care, usually within 3 to 5 weeks. The deaths were always attributed to natural causes, always occurred while Thomas was elsewhere in the house, and always came after he had prepared the family emotionally for the end. What made it so difficult to detect was his strategic approach. Thomas only took on cases involving people who were already in severe decline, elderly, chronically ill, or near the end. Families were thankful for his willingness to help where others wouldn't. They accepted the deaths as inevitable, not realizing the thread connecting them all. Even more calculated was Thomas's travel pattern. He never stayed in one county long enough to raise suspicion, weaving a careful route across rural Kansas. Months, sometimes years would pass before he returned to a particular region, by which time memories had faded and his reputation preceded him as a gifted, compassionate caregiver. It wasn't until August 1875, in the quiet farming town of Oskaloosa, that Thomas's true nature began to unravel. Reverend Jonathan Hartwell, a 67-year-old community pillar and longtime Baptist minister, had been suffering from a weak heart. His doctor called it a failing of the heart, a condition that left the Reverend fatigued and short of breath, but not in immediate danger. After a severe episode left him bedridden, his daughter Elizabeth hired Thomas Whitfield to help. She had heard about him through word of mouth and believed she was bringing in someone who would ease her father's suffering. Reverend Hartwell's failing health had already drawn concern from his congregation, but no one could have predicted that his final days would lead to the uncovering of a quiet killer hiding behind a caregiver's smile. Thomas Whitfield's care for Reverend Hartwell followed the same careful pattern he'd repeated in household after household. He was attentive, knowledgeable, and reassuring, establishing a treatment routine that appeared to stabilize the Reverend's heart condition. For the first 2 weeks, Hartwell actually improved. But unlike Thomas's past patients, many of whom had been confused, frail, or mentally diminished, Hartwell remained mentally sharp and quietly observant. Years spent counseling the troubled had given him a keen intuition for human behavior, and something about Thomas didn't sit right. On the morning of August 15th, 1875, Hartwell summoned his daughter Elizabeth for what he called an urgent conversation. She later told investigators her father seemed deeply unsettled, more so than at any other time during his illness, despite having physically improved. He confided that Thomas had been asking unusual questions about church finances, the family's money, and whether any valuables were kept in the house. But it wasn't the questions that disturbed him most. It was the way Thomas looked at him when he thought no one was watching. Hartwell described his caregiver's expression as cold and clinical, as if studying a subject rather than tending to a person. Even more unsettling were the nights. Hartwell claimed to have awoken several times to find Thomas standing silently by his bed, not administering medication, not checking vitals, just watching. It felt to him like Thomas was waiting, not for improvement, but for something to happen. Alarmed, he begged Elizabeth never to leave him alone with the young man again, not even for a few minutes. Torn between her father's fear and her appreciation for Thomas's seemingly excellent care, Elizabeth promised to stay close. That afternoon, while preparing lunch, she heard her father cry out, not a call for help, but a panicked shout. Rushing to his room, she found Thomas standing over him, pillow in hand. He claimed he'd been adjusting it to ease the Reverend's discomfort, and that Hartwell had suddenly collapsed. The Reverend was unconscious, but breathing. Thomas explained it was likely a small cardiac episode, and said he had only been trying to make him comfortable. Dr. Wheeler was summoned, and his examination confirmed a heart-related incident. Yet when Hartwell regained consciousness, he made a chilling accusation in private. "Someone tried to smother me," he whispered to Wheeler. "I woke up to that young man pressing a pillow over my face. When I struggled, he pushed harder. I couldn't breathe. I thought I was going to die." Wheeler found himself in a difficult position. Hartwell was a respected community leader, and his story rang true. But Thomas Whitfield had a spotless record, an empathetic demeanor, and no apparent reason to harm his patient. Confronted with the accusation, Thomas responded with calm professionalism. He denied everything, suggesting Hartwell's memory was the product of oxygen deprivation and hallucinations, an explanation that medically speaking was plausible. His sincerity seemed unshakable. "It's not uncommon," he said, "for patients in cardiac distress to misinterpret reality. The important thing is that Reverend Hartwell is recovering, and I want to help however I can." Still, Dr. Wheeler couldn't shake his discomfort. He had seen this young man before, heard his strangely specific questions, and watched his unshaken calm in the presence of death. This time he decided to dig deeper. Over the following days, Wheeler began comparing records across county lines. What he found was alarming. In less than 6 months, Thomas had been present at 17 deaths spanning 3 counties. Each case had seemed isolated, but viewed together a grim pattern emerged: short-term care for terminally ill or elderly patients, death within weeks, and a swift departure before suspicion could grow. Several families also recalled small thefts, missing coins, jewelry, heirlooms dismissed at the time as accidents of grief. Worse yet, many of the glowing references Thomas had provided were fabricated. The families listed in his letters either didn't exist or denied any connection to a caregiver by that name. It became clear that Thomas Whitfield was a false identity, a construct designed to grant access to the homes of the vulnerable. As Wheeler widened his search, working with authorities in neighboring states, similar stories began to surface in Missouri, Nebraska, and Colorado. A young caregiver, a string of patient deaths, sudden disappearances. Each time the killer left no evidence, only grief and confusion. It was a predator, hidden in plain sight, cloaked in compassion. The breakthrough came when Wheeler sent a telegram to Dr. Samuel Harding in Missouri, asking if he knew of any young men with medical training who might have relocated to Kansas. The response was immediate and chilling. "Stop investigating immediately. Stop. Boy from Sedalia. Case stop, extremely dangerous. Stop. Will arrive Kansas soonest. Stop." Harding, now a retired physician, had spent the past 7 years quietly hunting Timothy Caldwell, the troubled boy who had disappeared from the Missouri State Hospital after years of disturbing behavior. In his private records were over 40 cases, unexplained deaths across the Midwest, each echoing the same cold precision, the same uncanny familiarity with medicine, and the same vanishing act when suspicion crept in. Now, for the first time, the trail had a name, a pattern, and a witness who had lived to tell the truth. Reverend Hartwell's accusation hadn't just exposed a killer. It had reopened the hunt for Timothy Caldwell. The string of deaths in Kansas marked the clearest and most chilling pattern Dr. Samuel Harding had seen since the disappearance of Timothy Caldwell from the Missouri State Hospital. Everything, the calculated selection of victims, the meticulous planning, the emotionally detached execution, aligned perfectly with the behavioral profile Harding had built during his time studying the boy. Now a young man operating under the name Thomas Whitfield Timothy had refined his methods and grown more dangerous with every passing year. Harding arrived in Oskaloosa 3 days after Reverend Hartwell's accusation, bringing his original journals from the Caldwell case, along with 7 years' worth of investigation notes and correspondence with law enforcement from Missouri to Colorado. His first stop was the Reverend's bedside. Hartwell's account of the attempted murder, the cold detachment, the clinical interest in suffering, the watchful presence during the night, mirrored the exact traits Harding had documented in the boy from Sedalia. Most conclusive was Hartwell's physical description. Pale blue eyes, blonde hair, a slender frame, and a small scar on the left hand. An old wound Harding remembered vividly from a scuffle at the Caldwell farm. "It's him," Harding told Dr. Wheeler. "He's been hiding in plain sight, and now he's made a mistake. He's let himself be seen." Harding concluded that Timothy was no longer the impulsive, sadistic child he once tracked. He had become methodical, selecting victims not just for vulnerability, but for strategic value. He was exploiting the natural trust placed in young caregivers and using that role to access private homes undetected. The minor thefts reported in the wake of his victims' deaths revealed a chilling evolution. Murder had become both a livelihood and a personal obsession. The money, Harding explained, isn't the motive. It's the mechanism. What he truly wants is to be there present in the final moments, studying death like it's a science. Harding and Wheeler devised a plan to stop him. They would coordinate with law enforcement across county and state lines, preparing for Timothy's usual tactic of vanishing once he sensed trouble. That urgency intensified when Thomas announced he would soon be leaving the Hartwell home, citing the Reverend's stable condition and a new opportunity in a neighboring county. Harding knew the signs well. This was Timothy's escape blueprint. He'd sensed the tightening net. Sheriff Marcus Thompson of Jefferson County quickly set up surveillance around the Hartwell property and along all major roads and train stations. Timothy wouldn't slip away this time. Over the next few days, surveillance revealed how much more dangerous Timothy had become. He didn't pack and flee, he observed. He was seen monitoring the sheriff's office, noting the movements of deputies and scouting potential escape routes into the countryside. But the most disturbing revelation came when he was spotted visiting the local cemetery multiple times, recording names and dates from gravestones into a small leather-bound journal. Harding understood immediately. Timothy wasn't just planning to disappear. He was preparing his next identity. Gravestone names, particularly of young men who had recently died or gone unclaimed, provided the perfect raw material for new aliases. "He's not running," Harding warned. "He's reinventing. He's turning murder into a profession, and this is how he stays ahead of us." Then came the break investigators needed. One of Sheriff Thompson's deputies observed Timothy meeting a man near an abandoned grain mill just outside town. The meeting was covert and brief, only 20 minutes, but the man was later identified as Marcus Sullivan, a recently released con artist known for fraud and document forgery in Missouri. Under interrogation, Sullivan confessed that Timothy had hired him multiple times to forge false identities, references, and employment histories. According to Sullivan, Timothy had commissioned at least 6 complete sets of forged documents over the past 7 years. Each identity was designed with professional detail, background stories, letters of recommendation, and even staged references. This system allowed him to maintain the illusion of credibility, gain access to vulnerable homes, and leave before anyone connected the dots. Timothy wasn't just impersonating a caregiver. He was building entire lives to support his work. The truth was now undeniable. Timothy Caldwell had evolved into a master manipulator, a predator using grief trust and institutional blind spots as weapons. But for the first time since his disappearance, the mask had begun to slip, and law enforcement had the tools and the witnesses to finally hunt him in earnest. The revelations from Marcus Sullivan marked a terrifying escalation in the Timothy Caldwell case. More than just a string of isolated killings, the investigation now pointed to something far more ambitious. A calculated large-scale act of violence unlike anything the investigators had encountered. According to Sullivan, Timothy had grown tired of isolated murders. He was seeking something more significant, something unforgettable. He wanted to leave a mark. He spoke of a grand project, a perfect scenario involving an ideal family where he could execute what he chillingly referred to as comprehensive experiments. This wasn't just a continuation of Timothy's dark fascination with death. It was its evolution. The scattered murders across Kansas and neighboring states had been tests rehearsals. Timothy had been refining his ability to infiltrate families, gain trust, and manipulate grief with surgical precision. Now, he was preparing to scale those skills into something horrifyingly methodical. Dr. Harding warned that Timothy's ultimate goal appeared to be the destruction of an entire family, not only physically, but emotionally and psychologically, an experiment in prolonged human suffering, masked beneath a facade of caregiving. Urgency turned into alarm when Timothy, still posing as Thomas Whitfield, abruptly disappeared from the Hartwell household. Elizabeth reported that he had left early in the morning under the pretense of running final errands, but had not returned by nightfall. A search of his room revealed that he had taken his belongings, except for one critical piece of evidence. Hidden under the mattress was a journal. Its contents confirmed everyone's worst fears. Inside were detailed profiles of the families Timothy had served, notes on their emotional states, financial vulnerabilities, and patterns of behavior. He wrote like a scientist, cataloging specimens, analyzing weaknesses, and measuring the impact of his manipulations. Most disturbing was an entire section dedicated to what he called the culmination project. In chilling detail, Timothy laid out his plan, the step-by-step psychological and physical dismantling of a single family, observing their reactions as they were slowly destroyed from within. His writing revealed a twisted desire to study how grief, fear, and helplessness could fracture human bonds. This wasn't murder for pleasure or money. It was research. A sociopathic thesis in death. The target was identified in the final pages: the Henderson family of Lancaster County, Nebraska. Wealthy, respected, and isolated, the Hendersons seemed the perfect subjects. William Henderson, the aging patriarch, was in declining health, and Timothy had already begun corresponding with the family under his usual false identity, offering his services as a caregiver. Their remote location made them especially vulnerable. The nearest neighbors were miles away. William's pride had kept him from seeking medical help until it was nearly too late, and the family, grateful for the offer of assistance, had unknowingly invited a predator into their home. With limited communication between states in 1875, telegrams to Nebraska law enforcement might not reach the Hendersons in time. Sheriff Thompson alerted authorities as quickly as possible, but the geography and the speed of travel worked in Timothy's favor. Faced with the likelihood that Caldwell was already en route, or worse, already there, Dr. Harding made a fateful decision. Despite his age and declining health, he would travel to Lancaster County himself. The responsibility, he believed, was his to bear. "Timothy Caldwell is my responsibility," he told Thompson before boarding the train. "I studied him. I documented his descent, and I failed to contain him. If this family dies, I'll carry their blood on my hands as much as he does." The journey took 3 grueling days by rail and coach, during which Harding pored over every piece of evidence he had collected in the last 7 years. He brought with him his original journals, handwritten psychological profiles, and records of every known killing that matched Timothy's methods. What disturbed him most was how far Timothy had come. The impulsive boy who once left bodies in his wake without thought had become a man capable of planning months in advance, of weaving trust, deception, and death into a single seamless act. And now, all of that knowledge was converging on the Henderson family. A family unaware that the man they welcomed into their home was a killer preparing to turn their lives into the final chapter of his twisted experiment. Timothy Caldwell had grown into something far more dangerous than the impulsive, disturbed boy Dr. Harding had once studied. He had become a calculating predator, operating with a level of sophistication that bordered on clinical brilliance. And now he was in position to execute the most elaborate and devastating phase of his plan. The race to reach the Henderson farm became a desperate one when word arrived that Thomas Whitfield had already been welcomed into the household. Every moment of delay increased the risk that the family was being subjected to the twisted experiment outlined in Timothy's journal. What followed was a scene straight from a nightmare. Dr. Harding arrived on a bleak October morning alongside Sheriff Robert Kane of Lancaster County and 2 deputies. At first glance, the farm appeared peaceful, smoke from the chimney grazing livestock, but subtle inconsistencies set off alarm bells. The dogs were absent, the farm was unusually quiet for the early hour, and most ominously, several windows were darkened with closed curtains blocking any view inside. Something was wrong. Sheriff Kane approached with caution, his weapon drawn. When he knocked, there was no answer, despite clear sounds of movement inside and smoke still curling from the hearth. The door was unlocked, unusual for a remote farm with a stranger staying under its roof. Stepping inside, Kane called out his name and title. The response was immediate and chilling. A weak cry for help followed by the sound of a door slamming and footsteps fleeing toward the rear of the house. Inside the main room, the horror was unmistakable. William Henderson sat tied to a chair near the fireplace, gaunt, bruised, and exhausted. His wife Margaret lay unconscious on a nearby sofa, likely drugged. Around them, the room had been transformed into a perverse laboratory. Furniture had been rearranged with exacting symmetry. Tables bore notebooks, medical instruments, and charts. The walls were covered with diagrams, meticulously detailed graphs and observations, documenting the family's emotional and physical responses to prolonged stress. Timothy had begun his culmination project. Over the course of a week, he had turned the Henderson home into a site of psychological experimentation. According to William, barely coherent through trauma and dehydration, Timothy had separated family members, rationed food and water, manipulated emotions, and forced them to make impossible moral choices. He had alternated between gentle caregiver and cold tormentor, engineering moments of false hope and despair. He said it was all for science, William whispered. Said he wanted to see what families would do when they were forced to choose between themselves and each other. Before more could be learned, gunfire erupted at the rear of the house. Deputies shouted. Dr. Harding ran outside just in time to see Timothy Caldwell, tall, pale, and calm, standing in the open with his hands raised. But Harding knew the boy too well. The posture wasn't submission, it was performance. Don't trust him, Harding warned. He's planning something. Timothy's only reply was a chilling smile. The same smile he had worn as a boy after mutilating animals. The same smile that had haunted Harding's dreams for nearly a decade. That smile hadn't changed. Neither had the mind behind it. Dr. Harding, Timothy said, his tone eerily polite. I was wondering when you'd arrive. I hoped you would. What followed was less an arrest than an interview, a final monologue from a killer who saw himself not as a criminal, but as a pioneer. Timothy described his 7 years of freedom as a research sabbatical. He spoke not with remorse, but with pride. He detailed how he had refined his understanding of human vulnerability and perfected techniques of psychological manipulation. The murders weren't crimes, they were data points. You were right about me, he said, as if catching up with an old colleague. I was never going to develop empathy. But you were wrong when you thought I was broken. I'm not broken. I'm evolved. I'm what humans become when you strip away the weakness. Harding stood frozen as Timothy continued his voice, measured eyes bright with intellectual fervor. He recounted his time as a caregiver with academic precision, categorizing his victims by age, illness, resistance, and reaction. The Hendersons, he declared, were his masterpiece, a full family unit, studied under controlled stress. I've been able to observe how fear fractures loyalty, how grief poisons decision-making. I've documented everything. 43 deaths, detailed records, psychological profiles, community responses. It's all written down. It's the most complete study of mortality ever compiled. Wouldn't you like to read it? And for a fleeting moment, Harding was tempted. The scientist in him recognized the magnitude of what Timothy had recorded. No one in history, not even in the darkest corners of war or medical atrocity, had created such an extensive first-hand archive of death and psychological collapse. But then he looked into Timothy's eyes and saw not discovery, but devastation. It wasn't knowledge. It was the justification of a monster. Timothy Caldwell hadn't surrendered. He had staged his capture so that his final message, his findings, could be heard. This was his thesis defense, his finale, and it was far from over. Despite the horror of Timothy Caldwell's crimes, Dr. Harding couldn't help but feel a scientist's curiosity about the knowledge buried within the journals the young man had promised. Timothy had done what no ethical researcher ever could, conducting a series of deadly psychological experiments on real people under extreme stress. But Harding knew this offer was not a gift. It was bait. Timothy was once again probing for weakness, seeking to exploit Harding's dedication to truth and knowledge, in the same way he had exploited grief, trust, and desperation in his victims. Refusing to be drawn in, Harding focused instead on the only question that mattered. Where are the other family members? Timothy's smile deepened his satisfaction clear. That's part of the experiment, Dr. Harding. They're alive for now. But what happens to them depends entirely on what you do next. I've given you a choice: capture me and let them die, or save them and let me go. Justice or mercy. What followed exposed the full extent of Timothy's deranged brilliance. The Henderson property had been transformed into a trap, an intricate web of timed dangers, each designed to test the limits of decision-making under pressure. James Henderson, the eldest son, was trapped in the barn's hayloft, which had been rigged to collapse with any sudden movement. Mary, the daughter, was locked in the root cellar, with a leaking lantern slowly filling the air with deadly gas. The two young grandchildren were sealed in the well house, its supports weakened and flooding systems compromised to create an environment of gradual suffocation. This, Timothy said with almost childlike pride, is perfect design. Each rescue requires care and time. If you rush, they die. If you hesitate, they die. And if you try to catch me, they all die. Sheriff Kane's deputies launched the rescue operations, immediately dividing their attention between the three life-threatening situations. But Timothy had calculated correctly. The rescues were complex and time-consuming. Dr. Harding stood at the center of an impossible dilemma, facing the very kind of psychological crucible Timothy had been recreating in Holmes for years. "You're not trying to escape," Harding said at last. "You're trying to prove something about human nature." Timothy nodded, satisfied. "Exactly. This is my final study. I want to see how society chooses between the illusion of justice and the reality of suffering. I've studied individuals. I've studied families. Now I want to understand what happens when a system is forced to decide what kind of pain it can tolerate." It was clear that Timothy intended to escalate. He spoke of conducting experiments on entire communities' towns, subjected to fear and loss under the guise of unknown catastrophe. But despite the terror of his vision, Harding noticed a subtle shift in the young man's demeanor. Beneath the chilling confidence was something else, a quiet need for recognition. Timothy wasn't simply gloating, he was reaching out. "Your research has been impressive," Harding said carefully, walking a razor's edge. "But it's incomplete. You've studied death and suffering. You've never studied redemption. You've never studied recovery. You only understand half of the equation." For the first time, Timothy faltered. "Redemption is a lie," he said sharply. "It's a weakness people invented to explain failure." "Is it?" Harding pressed. "You've run for 7 years. You say you're beyond weakness, but you can't even face the consequences of what you've done. If you're as evolved as you claim, why not prove it by confronting the truth?" The psychological standoff stretched nearly an hour. During that time, Harding used everything he knew about Timothy's psychology. His craving for validation, his intellectual pride, his need to control to keep him engaged while the rescue teams worked. Gradually, the polished exterior began to crack. Timothy revealed glimpses of the boy he had once been, a boy damaged beyond repair, terrified by the feelings he could never grasp. "You think I wanted this?" he finally snapped. "You think I chose to be like this? I tried to feel what they feel. I tried to care. But I can't. I never could." The emotion was raw and real. It wasn't a performance. It was pain. For the first time in years, Timothy Caldwell showed something that resembled humanity, not empathy, but a desperate, hollow yearning to understand what he had never been able to experience. Just as he broke, the rescue teams completed their work. James, Mary, and the grandchildren were all saved, shaken, injured, but alive. And when Timothy heard the news, his reaction was not rage, but a strange kind of relief. "I'm glad they survived," he admitted quietly. "I never wanted them to die. I just wanted to know why people care so much. What makes them choose love over survival?" Timothy's arrest shocked the Midwest, making headlines across newspapers and towns still reeling from the scale of his crimes. Yet the legal system struggled to classify what exactly he was. The murders were undeniable, but many had occurred while he was still legally a minor. Combined with questions about his mental competency and the unique psychological profile presented by Dr. Harding, Timothy's case became one of the most complex criminal prosecutions in American legal history. Dr. Harding testified extensively, detailing Timothy's transformation from a troubled boy into a calculating killer. His testimony helped shape the legal framework for addressing criminal psychopathy, setting national precedents for how courts handle cases involving antisocial personality disorder. Timothy himself cooperated fully with the trial, not out of remorse, but because he saw the courtroom as a platform. He described his methods and motives with cold precision, treating the proceedings like a seminar on the science of suffering. His journal entries, diagrams, and confessions would become foundational texts in the study of criminal behavior and psychopathy for decades to come. The verdict was life imprisonment, without the possibility of parole, to be served in a specially constructed facility, equipped to contain both his danger and his value to psychological research. Dr. Harding continued visiting Timothy during his first year of incarceration. Their interviews, later published in academic journals, revolutionized how experts understood the inner world of the psychopath. Though Timothy's capacity for manipulation and violence remained as potent as ever, Harding observed that his hunger for intellectual connection had only deepened. He remained as ever fascinated by the same question he had never been able to answer. What makes people care, and why was he born unable to feel it? That question would haunt both men until the end of their lives. One asked it out of curiosity, the other out of longing. Narration rewrite final segment, Timothy Caldwell. He was not a monster from myth or a spirit of evil conjured from folklore. Timothy Caldwell was something far more unsettling. He represents something that medical science is only beginning to understand. Dr. Harding wrote in his final report. Not evil in the supernatural sense, but the product of a specific neurological pattern. Intelligence without empathy, curiosity without conscience. Understanding people like Timothy, he concluded, might be the key to preventing future horrors. The Henderson family survived, but the psychological wounds ran deep. William Henderson, once a quiet patriarch, became a national advocate for stronger screening of in-home caregivers, helping develop new safety protocols to prevent similar tragedies. Meanwhile, the journals Timothy had kept, meticulous clinical horrifying, became a grim treasure trove for criminal psychologists and law enforcement. His writings helped solve cold cases and laid groundwork for identifying behavioral patterns in emerging investigations. But the most lasting impact came from Dr. Harding's research. The Caldwell case catalyzed a shift in how early antisocial behavior in children was studied and treated. It shaped protocols, prevention strategies, and diagnostic frameworks for decades to come, with the goal of identifying dangerous patterns before they escalated into something irreversible. As for Timothy, he adapted to prison the way a biologist might adapt to a new environment, analytically, strategically. He became a model inmate, not because of rehabilitation, but because he understood how to simulate it. Guards described him as polite, articulate, and disturbingly perceptive. Harding's last visit to him in 1876 took place not long before the aging doctor's death. In that final conversation, Timothy revealed he had been treating the prison like a behavioral lab. "Prison is a perfect environment," he said. "Every subject classified by their particular psychological defect. I'm refining my theories here. I've learned more about criminal motivation in 1 year behind bars than in 7 years among free people." When asked if he felt any remorse, Timothy answered without hesitation, "I understand why what I did is considered wrong. I understand that others feel guilt, but I don't. I never have. I can mimic remorse well enough to convince a parole board, but the emotion simply doesn't exist in me." That brutal honesty ensured he would never be released. But it also made him one of the most studied criminal minds in American history. His case files were sealed for 50 years. When they were finally unsealed in the 1920s, they transformed the field of forensic psychology. His journals became required reading for FBI profilers, criminologists, and forensic psychiatrists. His psychological interviews influenced how psychopathy was defined and studied. And the legacy of Dr. Harding's pursuit became the foundation for how such criminals are understood today. Dr. Harding died in 1877, 1 year after Timothy's conviction. His final journal entry reflected not just on the man he had pursued, but on the darkness he had spent a decade trying to understand. Timothy Caldwell represents both a unique aberration and a window into the darkest possibilities of human development. Understanding him has been the most important work of my career, but I pray the world never meets another like him. Timothy Caldwell died in prison in 1923 at age 67. He spent nearly 5 decades under lock and key, contributing to psychological research while continuing to develop increasingly complex theories about the criminal mind. In his final interview, when asked if he regretted the path his life had taken, Timothy offered an answer that was as chilling as it was revealing. "I regret the lack of resources. The sample sizes were small, the conditions primitive. Had I been born later with access to modern research environments and larger populations, I believe I could have made genuine contributions to the science of human behavior." To the end, he viewed his victims not as people, but as lost opportunities for research. The story of Timothy Caldwell forces us to confront difficult, unsettling questions. What is the origin of conscience? Can someone born without empathy ever truly change? And more haunting still, could there be others like him among us, unseen and unsuspected? What do you believe created the mind of Timothy Caldwell. Was he born without the ability to feel, or did the world carve that absence into him? And most chilling of all, do you think there are others like him watching, waiting, hiding in plain sight? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more terrifying glimpses into America's forgotten past. The case of Timothy Caldwell may be closed, but the questions it leaves behind are still wide open. And the darkness he revealed may be closer than we think. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.